In the early years of the 20th century, when the streets of Brooklyn still echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the air hung thick with coal smoke, there stood a Victorian mansion at 124, Columbia Heights that would become the epicenter of one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Within those walls, young men and women worked day and night, convinced they were participating in the most important mission humanity had ever known, preparing the world for Armageddon, which their leader, Charles Taze Russell, had prophesied would arrive in 1914. But in March of 1909, something happened inside that building that would never be fully explained, something that would haunt the organization for over a century and leave a trail of silenced voices, destroyed documents, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. The mansion itself was unremarkable from the outside, just another ornate building in a neighborhood full of them, with its red brick facade and tall windows that reflected the gray Brooklyn sky. But inside, it was known by a different name: Bethel, the House of God. It was here that the Watchtower Society had established its new headquarters after moving operations from Pittsburgh, and it was here that the faithful came to live and work, surrendering their lives to what they believed was divine service. They worked the printing presses that churned out millions of copies of the Watchtower magazine. They bound books, they sorted mail from believers around the world, they cooked meals and cleaned floors and prayed together in the chapel. They did all of this for no pay, sustained only by room, board, and the conviction that they were soldiers in God's final war against Satan's system. Every volunteer who crossed the threshold of Bethel for the first time received the same introduction to their new life. After being shown to their modest sleeping quarters, after receiving their work assignments, after learning the schedules for meals and prayers and study, they were presented with a document. It was typed on official Watchtower letterhead, formal in language and grave in tone. The document was called the Vow of Loyalty, though some of the older workers had a different name for it. They called it the Pact. The wording was carefully chosen, almost biblical in its solemnity, and it required every new worker to pledge absolute confidentiality about everything that occurred within Bethel's walls. They were to speak to no one outside the organization about internal matters, about financial decisions, about disagreements or discussions among the leadership, about anything that might be considered private organizational business. The penalty for breaking this vow was never explicitly stated in the document itself, but everyone understood. To betray the confidence of Bethl was to betray Jehovah himself, and the consequences would be spiritual and eternal. Most volunteers signed without hesitation. They were young, idealistic, and genuinely believed they had been called to serve in the most privileged position imaginable. To work at Bethl meant to be close to Brother Russell himself, the man they believed had been chosen by God to reveal hidden truths about the Bible. It meant to be part of the inner circle, to see how decisions were made, to participate directly in the work of salvation. What did it matter if they had to keep a few organizational secrets? Every family had private matters that weren't discussed with outsiders, and the Watchtower Society was their spiritual family now. They signed their names with steady hands and grateful hearts, never imagining what that signature might one day cost them. The atmosphere inside Bethl was unlike anywhere else. The building itself seemed designed to enforce a particular kind of silence. The hallways were long and narrow, lined with closed doors behind which mysterious work was conducted. The floors were wooden and creaked at the slightest footfall, making it impossible to move through the building without announcing your presence. The printing room housed massive machines that clattered and banged throughout the day, but even that noise had a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality that seemed to discourage conversation. Workers communicated through hand signals and gestures, their faces set in masks of concentration. In the library, where Brother Russell's extensive collection of books was housed, there was an unwritten rule that conversation should never rise above a whisper, and most workers chose not to speak at all. Even meals in the dining hall, which should have been social occasions, were subdued affairs where talk centered on scripture and prophecy, never on personal matters or doubts or questions about how things were run. At night, when the printing presses finally fell silent and the workers retired to their separate dormitories, Bethl transformed into something else entirely. The building settled with groans and creaks that sounded almost human, as if the structure itself were alive and restless. Shadows moved in the poorly lit corridors. The wind off the East River rattled the windows. And behind the closed doors of the first-floor offices, where Brother Russell and his closest advisors had their private quarters, lights often burned well past midnight. Those who couldn't sleep would sometimes see the glow from the library windows, would hear the faint murmur of voices engaged in heated discussion, would wonder what matters could be so important that they required such late-night attention. But they never asked. Asking questions was discouraged at Bethel. The proper attitude was trust and obedience, faith that those taking the lead were being guided by Holy Spirit and knew things that ordinary workers didn't need to know. It was into this atmosphere of controlled silence and unquestioning devotion that William Harper arrived in September of 1908. He was 22 years old, fresh from a small farming community in upstate New York, and he approached his assignment at Bethel with the earnest dedication of a true believer. William had been raised in the truth, as they called it. His parents had become Bible students in the 1890s, back when Russell was still based in Pittsburgh, and William had grown up attending meetings, studying the Watchtower, and waiting eagerly for the end of the present system of things. When he received his invitation to serve at Bethel, his mother had wept with joy and his father had clasped his hand and told him he was the most blessed young man in America. William believed it too. He packed his few possessions, said goodbye to his family, and boarded the train to Brooklyn with his heart full of purpose. His assignment was in the correspondence office, a small room adjacent to Brother Russell's study where all incoming and outgoing mail was processed. It wasn't the most prestigious position at Bethel. That honor went to the editors and typesetters who worked directly on the publications, but it was important nonetheless. Letters arrived daily from Bible students around the world, asking doctrinal questions, reporting on their preaching activities, expressing concerns about various matters, and most importantly, sending donations to support the work. Every letter had to be opened, sorted, logged, and routed to the appropriate person for response. William proved to be meticulous at this work. He had neat handwriting, a methodical mind, and he understood the importance of accuracy. Within a few months, he'd earned the trust of his supervisors and was given additional responsibilities, including the handling of Brother Russell's personal correspondence. This meant that William saw things other workers didn't see. He saw the letters from wealthy donors, some of whom contributed thousands of dollars to the society's work. He saw correspondence from Bible student groups in other countries, reporting schisms and disagreements that never made it into the pages of the Watchtower. He saw legal documents related to the society's various court battles and property acquisitions. He saw letters from Russell's estranged wife Maria, who had left him years earlier and was now publicly criticizing his character and his teachings. William saw all of this, and he kept it confidential, just as his vow of loyalty required. He never spoke to the other workers about what crossed his desk. He never gossiped or speculated. He simply did his job with quiet efficiency, believing that he was serving God by protecting the privacy of those taking the lead. The morning of March 14, 1909, began like any other morning at Bethel. The wake-up bell rang at 5:30, its harsh clang echoing through the dormitories and pulling workers from whatever dreams or nightmares they'd been having. William rose in the pre-dawn darkness, washed his face in cold water from the communal basin, dressed in his work clothes, and made his way downstairs for morning prayer. The chapel was cold, their breath visible in the air as they sang hymns and listened to a brief talk from one of the elders about the importance of endurance in these last days. Breakfast followed, a simple meal of oatmeal and weak coffee, eaten in near silence. By 7 o'clock, William was at his desk in the correspondence office, ready to begin the day's work. The wooden box outside Brother Russell's study, where outgoing mail was placed for William to process, contained 3 letters that morning. 2 were routine responses to doctrinal questions, written in the neat hand of Russell's secretary. The 3rd was different. William recognized Russell's handwriting immediately. He'd seen it often enough to know the distinctive slant of the letters, the way Russell formed his capital letters with elaborate flourishes. The envelope was addressed to the Watchtower Society's former headquarters in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, specifically to the attention of the Financial Committee. What struck William immediately was that the envelope was unusually thick, suggesting multiple pages inside, and it bore Russell's personal wax seal on the back, pressed into red wax with his signet ring. This wasn't routine correspondence. Following the protocol he'd been taught, William opened the logbook and began to record the letter's details. Date: March 14, 1909. Time: 7:15 a.m. Sender: Charles T. Russell. Recipient: Financial Committee, Allegheny Office. Subject: This is where William paused. The envelope was sealed, so he couldn't know its exact contents, but the address suggested it concerned financial matters. He wrote "Financial and Administrative Matters" in the subject line, applied the appropriate postage, and placed the letter in the outgoing mail basket. At noon, as he did every day, William would carry the basket to the post office 3 blocks away and watch as the postal clerk accepted the letters and sorted them for delivery. It was routine, unremarkable. Except that this particular letter with Russell's personal seal, would never reach its destination. 3 days passed. William went about his normal duties, processing incoming mail, logging correspondence, routing letters to the appropriate departments. The weather turned warmer, an early hint of spring that made the air inside Bethel feel stuffy and close. On the morning of March 17th, William arrived at his office to find Brother Bonnet, who managed Bethel's day-to-day operations, waiting for him. Bonnet's expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made William's stomach tighten with unease. Without explanation, Bonnet asked William to accompany him to Brother Russell's study. It wasn't a request so much as a command. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it should have. William's mind raced through possibilities. Had he made an error in his work? Had a letter been misfiled? But he was always so careful, so meticulous. Bonnet knocked once on Russell's door and entered without waiting for a response. Inside, William found not just Russell but 3 other men. Brother Rutherford, the Society's legal counsel, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper mind. Brother Macmillan, head of the editorial department, who always looked slightly nervous, and Brother Van Amberg, who handled the Society's finances. The 4 men were arranged behind Russell's massive oak desk in a semicircle that reminded William uncomfortably of a court. He was told to sit in the single chair that faced them. Russell spoke first, and his voice was gentle but strained, as if he were forcing himself to remain calm. He asked William about a letter that had been placed in the outgoing box on March 14th, a letter addressed to Allegheny. William confirmed that yes, he had retrieved that letter, had logged it in the records, had taken it to the post office that same day at noon. Russell's next question came slowly, carefully. Was William absolutely certain the letter had been posted? Could there be any possibility that it had been misplaced, perhaps accidentally included with other papers, perhaps still sitting somewhere in the office? William felt his face grow hot. He knew where this was leading. He explained that he was certain, that he remembered the letter specifically because of the personal seal, that he had watched the postal clerk accept it along with the other mail that day. There could be no mistake. That's when Rutherford leaned forward and delivered the news that would change William's life. The letter had never arrived in Allegheny. The Financial Committee had confirmed they received no correspondence from Russell on or after March 14th. The letter, wherever it was, had disappeared somewhere between Russell's desk and its destination. And William Harper was the last person known to have handled it. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. William felt the blood drain from his face. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but what could he say? He had handled the letter. He had taken it to the post office. If it had disappeared, and if he was the last one to touch it, then by simple logic, he must somehow be responsible. But the situation was even more complicated than that, Russell explained in his measured, careful way. This wasn't just any letter. It contained sensitive information about financial matters, yes, but also certain doctrinal clarifications that Russell had felt were necessary to communicate to the Allegheny Committee. The contents were of a nature that Russell had deliberately chosen not to make a copy, feeling that the matters discussed were too delicate to exist in multiple documents. Now the letter was gone, and its contents were gone with it, and there was no way to recreate exactly what had been written. Russell looked directly at William when he said this, and William saw something in the older man's eyes that might have been regret or might have been suspicion. It was impossible to tell. The questions came faster then, overlapping, pressing. Had William opened the envelope? No, absolutely not. The seal had been intact. Had he shown the letter to anyone else? No, never. Had he discussed it with any of the other workers? No, he would never violate confidentiality. Had he perhaps, in a moment of curiosity, broken the seal just to glimpse what was inside? No, he would never do such a thing. The questions went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Finally, Russell raised his hand for silence. He explained that while they were not accusing William of any deliberate wrongdoing, the situation was nevertheless troubling. The letter's disappearance had created problems that needed to be addressed, and William's involvement in the matter, however innocent, made his continued presence at Bethel potentially problematic. It would be better, Russell suggested in a tone that made clear this was not a suggestion at all, if William were reassigned to field service for a time. A change of scenery would be spiritually refreshing for him, and it would remove him from a situation that might otherwise become a stumbling block to his faith. William tried to argue. He hadn't done anything wrong. The letter had been posted properly. If it had gone missing, that was the fault of the postal system, not his. But even as he spoke these words, he could see they were falling on deaf ears. Bonnet explained that a congregation in Pennsylvania, not far from William's hometown, had requested assistance with their preaching work. William would be expected to leave the following morning. His belongings would be packed for him. His parents would be informed that he had been given a new assignment in the field, a privilege that reflected his dedication and spiritual maturity. The meeting was over. William was dismissed. That evening, as William sat alone in his dormitory room, trying to process what had happened, his roommate Samuel White returned from his shift in the typesetting room. Samuel was 3 years older than William, a quiet young man who had been at Bethel for almost 3 years and who had the kind of steady, thoughtful temperament that made him a good listener. He immediately sensed something was wrong. When he asked what had happened, William hesitated. He had been instructed not to discuss the matter with anyone. But Samuel was his friend, perhaps his only real friend at Bethel, and the need to talk to someone, to have someone believe him, overwhelmed his caution. In a low voice, glancing repeatedly at the door to make sure no one was listening, William told Samuel everything. The missing letter. The interrogation. The reassignment that was clearly a punishment disguised as a privilege. He swore to Samuel that he had done nothing wrong, that the letter had been posted properly, that he was being made a scapegoat for something that wasn't his fault. Samuel's reaction was strange. Instead of expressing outrage on William's behalf or offering comfort, he simply stared at William for a long moment with an expression that might have been fear or might have been resignation. Then he moved closer and spoke in barely more than a whisper. He told William to drop the matter entirely, to go to Pennsylvania without protest, to never speak of the letter again. When William started to object, Samuel cut him off with an urgency that was almost desperate. He explained that 3 years ago there had been another worker at Bethel, a man in the editorial department who had questioned some changes being made to an article, who had asked to see the original manuscript to verify that the changes were accurate. That man had been sent to a congregation in Montana within 48 hours, reassigned for what were called spiritual reasons. Samuel had heard later, through channels he wouldn't name, that the man had eventually left the truth entirely, unable to reconcile what he'd seen at Bethel with what he'd believed about the organization. Samuel's message was clear, questioning what happened at Bethel, asking for explanations, insisting on transparency. These things didn't end well. The only safe course was obedience and silence. William left the next morning on an early train, his few possessions packed in a battered suitcase, his mind reeling with confusion and anger and a growing sense that something was very wrong with the organization he believed was directed by God himself. He would serve in that Pennsylvania congregation for 2 more years, going through the motions of faith while feeling increasingly hollow inside. In 1911, he would stop attending meetings altogether, unable to continue participating in something that had treated him so unjustly. His parents would be devastated, would write him letters begging him to return to Jehovah, would eventually stop speaking to him entirely when he refused. William would move west, would marry a woman who knew nothing of his past with the Bible students, would live an ordinary life and die an ordinary death in 1947, having never spoken publicly about what had happened to him at Bethel. But he would never forget that letter, never stop wondering what had been in it that was important enough to destroy a man's life over its disappearance. Back at Bethel, in the days and weeks following William Harper's departure, a strange quiet settled over the building. Samuel White found himself unable to stop thinking about his final conversation with William, unable to shake the feeling that he had witnessed something significant even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. The work continued as always. The printing presses ran, the books were bound, the magazines were shipped out to Bible students around the world, but there was a new tension in the air, a sense that something had shifted in ways that couldn't be openly acknowledged. Samuel began paying closer attention to things he would normally have ignored, small details and odd occurrences that suddenly seemed meaningful in light of what had happened to William. He noticed, for instance, that the mail handling procedures had been quietly changed. No longer did a single person process all the outgoing correspondence. Instead, a rotating team of 3 workers now handled the mail together, and every piece had to be logged by all 3 before it could be sent. The official explanation was that this new system was more efficient, provided better accountability. But Samuel understood the real reason. If another letter went missing, no single person could be blamed. The responsibility would be diffused, shared, impossible to pin on any individual. It was a system designed not for efficiency but for protection, insurance against another William Harper situation. He also noticed that some of the older workers, men who had been at Bethel for 5 years or more, had developed a particular kind of guardedness in their expressions and their conversations. They smiled when they were supposed to smile, they participated in discussions about scripture and prophecy, but there was something hollow about it, as if they were performing roles rather than expressing genuine feelings. Samuel began to wonder how many of them had seen things similar to what had happened to William. How many of them had learned through experience that certain questions should never be asked and certain observations should never be voiced. It was Edward Morrison who finally spoke to Samuel about what was really going on. Edward worked in the bindery department, where the finished books and magazines were assembled and prepared for shipping. He was nearly 30 years old, which made him ancient by Bethel standards where most workers were in their early 20s, and he had been there for 5 years. He had the kind of face that revealed nothing, the kind of steady, neutral expression that came from years of practice at not reacting to things. 2 weeks after William's departure, Edward approached Samuel during a brief break in the courtyard behind the building, one of the few places where conversation might go unnoticed. After glancing around to make sure they were alone, Edward asked Samuel if he knew what had really happened with William Harper and the missing letter. Samuel admitted that he only knew what William had told him, that a letter had disappeared and William had been blamed. Edward nodded slowly, then told Samuel something that William himself hadn't known, something Edward had learned through his own connections among the longer-serving workers. The letter that had disappeared hadn't just contained routine financial information. According to Edward's sources, it concerned a very large donation from a wealthy businessman in Pittsburgh, a man whose financial support was crucial to the society's continued operations. The problem was that this donation had come with conditions. The donor wanted certain articles published in the Watchtower, certain positions taken on specific doctrinal matters, certain people given particular responsibilities within the organization. He was essentially trying to buy influence, to use his money to shape the direction of the society. Russell had initially agreed to these conditions, Edward explained, perhaps because the financial situation was desperate enough that he felt he had no choice. But afterward, he'd had second thoughts. The letter to Allegheny had contained Russell's instructions to return the donation, along with a detailed explanation of why he felt accepting money with such strings attached compromised the spiritual integrity of the organization. It was a principled stand, a refusal to let money dictate doctrine. But before the letter could reach Allegheny, certain people at Bethel had intervened. Brother Rutherford primarily, Edward suggested, though he couldn't prove it. Rutherford and others in the leadership believed the donation was too important to refuse, that Russell was being impractical, that accommodating the donor's wishes was a small price to pay for financial security. They had intercepted the letter. They had blamed its disappearance on William Harper. And they had kept the donation. Samuel wanted to dismiss this as mere speculation, conspiracy thinking, the kind of story that bitter people told to explain away things they didn't understand. But it fit too well with what he'd observed, explained too many otherwise puzzling details. If the story was true, it meant the organization he'd devoted his life to was willing to lie, willing to destroy an innocent man's reputation, willing to put financial interests above spiritual principles. The implications were devastating. Samuel asked Edward how he could be sure this was what had really happened, demanded proof, evidence, something concrete. Edward just shrugged. There was no proof, he said. That was the whole point. The letter was gone. Any financial records that might reveal the truth were kept locked in offices they had no access to. All they had were whispers, fragments of overheard conversations, patterns that suggested something was being hidden. But wasn't that lack of transparency itself revealing? In an organization that claimed to value truth above all else, why were so many things kept secret? Why was asking questions treated as disloyalty? Samuel didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his narrow bed in the darkened dormitory, listening to the breathing of his roommates, and felt something crumbling inside him. He had come to Bethel believing it was the center of truth in a world of lies, the one place where honesty and righteousness ruled. But if Edward was right, if the leadership was willing to engage in deception and cover-ups, if asking uncomfortable questions could get you exiled, then what did that say about everything he believed? He tried to pray, to ask Jehovah for guidance, but the words felt empty. How could he pray to a God he supposedly accessed through an organization he was starting to suspect was corrupt? Over the following weeks, Samuel tried to continue as if nothing had changed. He showed up for his shifts in the typesetting room, set type for articles about honesty and integrity and submission to God's appointed authority, all while wondering if the people writing these articles actually believed what they were saying or if it was all just propaganda designed to keep the rank and file obedient. He attended morning prayers and listened to talks about the importance of loyalty to the organization, and he kept his face carefully neutral even as his mind screamed objections. He went through all the motions of being a faithful Bethel worker while feeling increasingly like a fraud. His breaking point came in mid-April when he was working on an article Russell had written about financial stewardship. One paragraph in particular seemed designed to address questions about how donations were being used. Russell wrote that the faithful steward manages resources with complete transparency, hiding nothing from those who support the work, and that every dollar donated was used exactly as the donor intended, never diverted for other purposes. Samuel read that paragraph over and over, setting the type with hands that shook slightly. If Edward's story was true, if that letter had contained Russell's instructions to return a donation that came with unacceptable conditions, and if that letter had been deliberately intercepted, then this article was a lie. Not just an error or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate falsehood printed and distributed as if it were divine truth. Samuel felt physically ill. He knew he should keep his thoughts to himself, should maintain the careful silence that seemed to be the primary survival skill at Bethel. But he needed to talk to someone, needed to know if others shared his doubts or if he was losing his mind. That evening, he sought out Edward Morrison. They met in the same courtyard where Edward had first told him about the missing letter. This time Samuel did most of the talking, pouring out his confusion and anger and fear, describing the article he'd been typesetting and asking Edward how they could possibly continue working for an organization that seemed to have abandoned the very principles it claimed to represent. Edward listened without interrupting, and when Samuel finally ran out of words, Edward's response was quiet and devastating. He told Samuel that he'd been asking himself the same questions for 2 years now, ever since he'd first realized that things at Bethel weren't what they appeared to be. He'd stayed partly because leaving would mean admitting he'd wasted years of his life on a lie, partly because leaving would devastate his family who were so proud of his service, and partly because he genuinely didn't know what else to do with his life. But staying was eating him alive, turning him into someone he didn't recognize, forcing him to participate in something he increasingly believed was wrong. He told Samuel that every day he woke up and had to choose between his conscience and his community, between what he knew to be true and what he was required to pretend to believe. It was, he said, the hardest thing he'd ever done. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a door opening. Both men looked up to see Brother Bonnet stepping into the courtyard, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the windows. He greeted them pleasantly enough, asked what they were doing out here so late, suggested it might be time for them to retire to their dormitories. But there was something in his tone that wasn't quite a question, something that suggested he knew exactly what they'd been discussing. Samuel and Edward separated immediately, each heading to their respective rooms, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been watched, that someone had heard them, that their moment of honesty was going to have consequences. He was right. 2 days later, Samuel was called to Bonnet's office. The conversation was similar to the one William Harper had experienced, though the tone was slightly different. Bonnet didn't accuse Samuel of anything specific. Instead, he expressed concern about Samuel's spiritual health, suggested that he seemed troubled and distracted lately, wondered if Samuel was allowing doubts to take root in his mind. He reminded Samuel of the importance of trust, of accepting that those taking the lead had access to information that ordinary workers didn't have, of understanding that sometimes organizational decisions seemed mysterious but were actually evidence of divine guidance working in ways humans couldn't fully comprehend. He quoted Hebrews about being obedient to those taking the lead, about not thinking independently but submitting to appointed authority. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that Samuel's parents were so proud of his service at Bethel that it would be tragic if something happened to damage their pride in their son, if Samuel were to be sent away for what some might interpret as an independent spirit or a tendency toward apostasy. The threat was clear even though it was never stated directly. If Samuel continued to ask questions, if he persisted in discussing his doubts with other workers, if he failed to demonstrate the proper attitude of submissive trust, he would be removed from Bethel. And that removal would be framed in such a way that it would devastate his parents and likely result in his being shunned by his entire community. Samuel understood that he was being given a choice, comply and stay silent, or maintain his integrity and lose everything. He told Bonnet that he understood, that he appreciated the counsel, that he would work on adjusting his attitude. Bonnet smiled and told him he was glad to hear it, that he'd always seen great potential in Samuel. The meeting ended with a handshake and a reminder that Jehovah loved those who proved themselves faithful during tests. Samuel returned to his work, but something had changed irreversibly. He realized that the organization he believed was seeking truth was actually in the business of manufacturing compliance. Questions were reframed as doubt. Doubt was reframed as spiritual weakness. And spiritual weakness was grounds for removal. It was a perfect closed system, one that made it impossible to challenge anything without being labeled as someone who lacked faith. Samuel continued going through the motions, but inside he was planning his exit, trying to figure out how to leave without triggering the kind of dramatic confrontation that would result in complete ostracism from his family and community. His chance came 3 weeks later when he learned that Edward Morrison had been suddenly reassigned. The official announcement was that Edward had requested a transfer to a congregation in Ohio, feeling that he needed a change of pace and wanted to focus on direct evangelism work rather than organizational support. But Samuel knew better. Edward hadn't requested anything. He'd been removed, likely because someone had reported his conversations, his questions, his failure to demonstrate the proper attitude of unquestioning loyalty. Samuel realized that if they were removing Edward, his own removal was probably not far behind. He decided to act first. He requested a private meeting with Bonnet and told him that he'd been doing a lot of praying and soul-searching, and he felt that Jehovah was directing him toward field service rather than organizational work. He said it with the right tone of humility and spiritual sincerity, framed it as a personal leading rather than a criticism of Bethel or a response to anything that had happened there. Bonnet studied him carefully, clearly trying to determine if this was genuine or if Samuel was simply trying to leave before he could be pushed out. Finally, Bonnet agreed that if Samuel truly felt this was Jehovah's will, they wouldn't stand in his way. Arrangements would be made for Samuel to be assigned to a congregation in upstate New York, far enough from Brooklyn that he wouldn't be able to visit easily but close enough to his family that the transfer wouldn't seem suspicious. Samuel left Bethel in late September of 1909, 6 months after William Harper's departure. He served in that upstate congregation for 2 years, growing more and more alienated from the organization with each passing month. The phoniness of it all became unbearable once he'd seen behind the curtain. He knew now that the organization wasn't being run by Holy Spirit but by men who were willing to lie and manipulate to maintain their power and protect their image. He knew that loyalty mattered more than truth, that appearance mattered more than reality, that preserving the institution took precedence over treating people justly. In 1912, at the age of 24, Samuel stopped attending meetings entirely. His family was devastated. His father wrote him anguished letters begging him to return before Armageddon arrived in 1914. When 1914 came and went without the world ending, Samuel felt a bitter vindication that didn't bring him any joy. He moved to California, changed his name to something that wouldn't be immediately associated with his family, and spent the rest of his life trying to build an identity that wasn't connected to the Watchtower Society. He married, had children, worked ordinary jobs, and tried not to think too much about those months at Bethel and what he'd witnessed there. But in 1951, dying of lung cancer and knowing he didn't have much time left, Samuel wrote a long letter to his oldest son. In it, he described his time at Bethel in detail, explained what had happened with William Harper and the missing letter, and tried to articulate what he'd learned about how religious organizations operate when they believe themselves to be above accountability. He wrote that he didn't know if the story Edward Morrison had told him about the donation and the intercepted letter was true. He'd never found proof. But he knew that an organization willing to silence questions, to destroy documents, to remove anyone who asked for transparency, was an organization that had something to hide. And an organization that had something to hide wasn't being directed by a God who supposedly valued truth. The letter was found among Samuel's papers after his death, read by his son who had never known about his father's past with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and eventually filed away in a box of family documents. It would be decades before it resurfaced, discovered by a researcher who immediately recognized its historical significance. By then, everyone who had been at Bethel in 1909 was long dead. But the pattern Samuel had identified, the methods of control and silencing he'd described, those were still very much alive within the organization. The specifics changed over the years. Different people, different controversies, different scandals, but the fundamental approach remained the same. When embarrassing information emerged, suppress it. When people asked difficult questions, remove them. When transparency threatened the organization's image, choose secrecy. It was a playbook written in 1909 and still in use more than a century later. But what about the letter itself? What about that thick envelope with Russell's personal seal, the one that had supposedly contained instructions about returning a donation with unacceptable conditions attached? If Edward Morrison's theory was correct, if the letter had indeed been intercepted rather than lost, what happened to it? Did it survive somewhere, hidden in a file or locked in a safe? Or was it destroyed to ensure it could never contradict the official story? The answer came 5 weeks after William Harper's removal from Bethel, and it came in the middle of the night in a way that would haunt several workers for the rest of their lives. It was late May, the weather finally warm enough that the windows in the dormitories could be left open to catch the breeze off the river. Samuel White, still at Bethel at this point and still struggling with his growing disillusionment, had been unable to sleep. Insomnia had become his constant companion, his mind too busy with questions and doubts to shut down properly. He was lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling and counting the cracks in the plaster, when he heard unusual sounds from the courtyard below. He got up and moved to the window, careful not to wake his roommates. In the courtyard, illuminated by several oil lamps, he saw 3 men carrying wooden boxes. He recognized them immediately. Brother Macmillan from the editorial department, Brother Van Amberg who managed the society's finances, and a younger man Samuel didn't know by name but who worked in the archives. They set the boxes down near an old metal drum that was normally used for burning trash and garbage. Then they began removing items from the boxes and feeding them into the drum. Even from the 3rd floor, Samuel could see they were papers. Lots and lots of papers. As the flames grew higher, the smell of burning paper and ink drifted up to the dormitories, acrid and unmistakable. Samuel watched for nearly an hour as the 3 men systematically emptied box after box into the fire. They worked in complete silence, their faces set in grim determination, occasionally using a metal rod to poke at the burning papers and ensure they were thoroughly consumed. There was something ritualistic about it, something that suggested this was being done with great care and purpose. These weren't random documents being disposed of. This was a deliberate destruction of specific materials, and it was being conducted in the middle of the night when most workers were asleep. The next morning at breakfast, Samuel noticed he wasn't the only one who looked tired. Several other workers had dark circles under their eyes, and more than one person's gaze drifted toward the windows overlooking the courtyard. They'd seen it too. They all knew something significant had happened in the night. But no one spoke about it. The silence was complete and oppressive, everyone understanding that acknowledging what they'd witnessed would be dangerous. That morning's prayer service was led by Brother Bonnet, who chose to read from Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Be obedient to those who are taking the lead among you and be submissive, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will render an account, so that they may do this with joy and not with sighing, for this would be damaging to you. As Bonnet read those words, his eyes moved slowly across the assembled workers, lingering on certain faces. Samuel felt the weight of that gaze when it reached him. The message was unmistakable. We know you saw. We know you know. Don't ask. Don't discuss. Just obey. The rest of the day, the corridors of Bethel were quieter than Samuel had ever experienced them. Workers moved through their duties like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with secrets and fear and the knowledge that they were all complicit in something they didn't fully understand but knew was wrong. In the weeks that followed, the official story about William Harper's transfer solidified and spread. A circular was sent to all Bible student congregations explaining that Brother Harper had been reassigned to field service to better utilize his gifts for evangelism. There was no mention of any missing correspondence, no reference to any kind of problem or controversy. It was presented as a routine organizational decision, the kind of thing that happened all the time as the society worked to place people where they could be most effective. For most Bible students who hadn't been at Bethel and didn't know the real story, this explanation was entirely satisfactory. William Harper had been given a new assignment. Good for him. They thought nothing more of it. But inside Bethel, among those who had been there when it happened, the incident became a kind of unspoken legend. Workers didn't discuss it openly, but they all knew about it, all understood that it represented something important about how things really worked in the organization. When new volunteers arrived and signed their vow of loyalty, The older workers would sometimes exchange glances that the newcomers didn't understand. They were thinking about William Harper, about the letter that disappeared, about the papers burned in the courtyard, about all the questions they'd learned not to ask. The incident became a sort of initiation, a moment when idealistic young believers realized that the organization they devoted their lives to was more complicated and more problematic than they'd imagined. Some workers, confronted with this reality, chose to rationalize it away, to convince themselves that whatever had happened was justified by the greater good of the preaching work. Others, like Samuel White and Edward Morrison, couldn't make peace with it and eventually left. But all of them were changed by it. All of them carried the knowledge of what they'd witnessed for the rest of their lives. The official story remained consistent for decades. When historians later researched this period of Watchtower history, they found no records of any missing correspondence, no documentation of any controversy involving William Harper, no evidence of any documents being destroyed. The organization's archives contained only the sanitized version of events. Harper had been transferred to field service in 1909 as part of normal organizational operations. End of story. When former Bethel workers occasionally mentioned the incident in later years, their accounts were dismissed as the bitter fabrications of apostates who had left the truth and were trying to damage the organization's reputation. Without documentation, without hard evidence, their stories were just stories, easily denied and impossible to prove. But the absence of documentation is itself telling. Why were there no records? In an organization as bureaucratic as the Watchtower Society, where everything was supposed to be carefully logged and filed, how could an entire incident simply vanish from the historical record? The most likely explanation is that it was deliberately erased, that whatever documents existed were among those burned in that courtyard in May 1909, that the official archives were curated to remove anything that might raise uncomfortable questions or cast the leadership in a negative light. This kind of historical sanitization is common in institutions that value their image more than they value transparency. But it means that the real history, the messy and complicated truth of what actually happened, becomes increasingly difficult to recover as time passes and the people who witnessed events die off. Today, if you visit the current headquarters of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Warwick, New York, you won't find much trace of that first Bethel building in Brooklyn. The organization moved out of Columbia Heights decades ago, and the building has since been converted to luxury condominiums. There's a small plaque noting that it once housed the Watchtower Society, but no mention of the stories that unfolded within those walls, no acknowledgement of the people whose lives were appended there. The organization's archives, however, remain meticulously maintained in climate-controlled storage. Boxes and boxes of historical documents, carefully catalogued and preserved, containing letters and financial records and meeting minutes and legal documents dating back to Russell's era. Access to these archives is strictly controlled. Researchers must apply for permission months in advance, demonstrating legitimate scholarly interest and agreeing to restrictions on what they can photograph or copy. But even with permission, certain materials are permanently off-limits, classified as internal organizational documents not suitable for outside review. One of these restricted boxes bears the inventory number BKH 09-17, which indicates Bethel historical materials from 1909, Box 17. According to the catalog description, it contains correspondence and administrative documents from March through June 1909, including financial records and internal memoranda. No outside researcher has ever been granted access to Box BKH 09-17. Requests are politely but firmly declined with explanations that vary depending on who's asking and what reason they give for wanting access. The documents are too fragile. They contain confidential donor information. They're not relevant to the stated research topic. They're being reorganized and are temporarily unavailable. The explanations change, but the answer is always no. When persistent researchers push back, asking on what grounds public access is being denied to century-old documents, the response is consistent. The Watchtower Society is a private religious organization under no legal obligation to open its archives to the public, and materials deemed sensitive by the organization will remain restricted regardless of their age. What's actually in Box BKH 09-17? The most likely answer, based on the date range and the level of restriction, is that it contains documents related to the William Harper incident and the missing letter. Perhaps it contains the actual letter itself, recovered after being intercepted but never sent. Perhaps it contains internal memos discussing how to handle the situation, revealing that the official story was indeed a cover-up. Perhaps it contains financial records showing the large donation that Edward Morrison had described, along with documentation of the conditions the donor tried to impose. Or perhaps the box contains nothing at all, having been emptied long ago, and the restriction is maintained simply to avoid acknowledging that potentially significant historical materials were destroyed. The uncertainty itself is revealing. An organization truly confident in its own history, truly convinced that its leadership has always acted with integrity and transparency, would have no reason to seal its archives. The existence of restricted boxes containing century-old documents suggests an ongoing concern about what might be revealed if those materials became public. It suggests that even today, more than 100 years after the events of March 1909, the Watchtower Society remains protective of secrets that might undermine its carefully constructed narrative about its past. For the descendants of those who were there, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of William Harper and Samuel White and Edward Morrison and all the other young workers who served at Bethel in those early years, the sealed archives represent something profoundly frustrating. These were real people whose lives were disrupted, whose faith was shattered, whose relationships with family were destroyed because they dared to ask questions or refused to participate in what they believed was wrong. They deserved to have their stories known, to have the record show what actually happened to them. But that record remains locked away, accessible only to those with the authority to decide what parts of history should be revealed and what parts should stay hidden. Some former members of the Jehovah's Witnesses have suggested that the organization should establish a truth and reconciliation process, similar to those created in countries dealing with painful historical events, where past mistakes could be openly acknowledged and discussed without fear of retribution. They argue that confronting the organization's history honestly, including its failures and cover-ups, would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken faith, demonstrating that the organization can grow and change and learn from its mistakes. But such suggestions are typically met with silence or dismissal. The official position is that the organization has nothing to apologize for, nothing to explain, nothing to reconcile. Any problems in the past were either misunderstandings blown out of proportion by enemies of the truth or necessary actions taken by imperfect humans doing their best to serve God under difficult circumstances. This unwillingness to acknowledge or examine problematic aspects of institutional history means that the same patterns keep repeating. The methods used to silence William Harper in 1909, immediate removal, framing it as a spiritual decision, making it clear that discussing the real reasons would have consequences, are still being used today when members ask difficult questions or raise concerns about organizational policies. The midnight document burnings have been replaced by more sophisticated data management and retention policies, but the underlying principle is the same. Control what information exists and who has access to it. The vow of loyalty that workers signed in 1909 has evolved into more extensive non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality policies, but the purpose remains unchanged. Ensure that whatever happens inside the organization stays inside the organization. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how institutions operate when they believe themselves to be above accountability, when they conflate criticism of the organization with criticism of God Himself, when they create systems that make it almost impossible to challenge decisions or question policies without being labeled as spiritually weak or apostate. The specific details of what happened in 1909, whether that letter really was intercepted, what exactly it contained, who made the decision to silence William Harper, may never be fully known. But the broader truth is evident in the patterns that have persisted for over a century. The Watchtower Society operates as an organization that prizes loyalty over truth, conformity over conscience, and institutional preservation over individual justice. The workers who were at Bethel in 1909 and who witnessed these events had to make impossible choices. They could comply with the demands for silence, could suppress their doubts and continue serving despite knowing that something was deeply wrong, could rationalize away their concerns by telling themselves that imperfect humans sometimes made mistakes but the organization as a whole was still God's chosen instrument. Or they could follow their consciences, could refuse to participate in what they believed was corruption and dishonesty, and accept the devastating consequences, losing their positions, being separated from their families, being shunned by their entire community. There was no good choice, only degrees of compromise and loss. For William Harper, whose only crime was handling a letter that someone else wanted to disappear, the cost was particularly steep. He lost his position at what he'd believed was the center of God's organization. He lost the respect of his parents who never fully understood why he'd been sent away. He eventually lost his faith entirely, unable to reconcile what had been done to him with any reasonable understanding of divine justice. He lived the rest of his life as an ordinary man in an ordinary place, but he carried the knowledge of what had happened to him, carried the questions that had never been answered, carried the anger that came from being used as a scapegoat for something that wasn't his fault. He died without vindication, without acknowledgement, without even the satisfaction of knowing what had been in that letter that had cost him so much. The real tragedy of the missing letter of 1909 isn't just what happened to William Harper or Samuel White or Edward Morrison, though their individual stories are tragic enough. The real tragedy is what the incident revealed about an organization that millions of people trusted to be honest, transparent, and guided by divine wisdom. It revealed that when protecting the institution conflicted with treating people justly, the institution came first. It revealed that when maintaining appearances conflicted with acknowledging uncomfortable truths, appearances won. It revealed that an organization claiming to have a monopoly on truth was willing to suppress truth when truth became inconvenient. And perhaps most devastatingly, it revealed that this willingness to prioritize institutional interests over individual people and uncomfortable facts wasn't an aberration or a one-time failure, but rather a core operating principle that would persist for more than a century. The workers who served at Bethel in 1909 couldn't have known they were witnessing the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself again and again in different forms over the following decades. They couldn't have known that the methods used to silence them would still be in use 100 years later. They couldn't have known that the archives documenting what happened to them would be sealed away, their stories erased from official history, their experiences dismissed and denied by an organization that had moved on to new buildings and new workers while maintaining the same fundamental approach to controlling information and suppressing dissent. The letter itself, that thick envelope with Russell's personal seal, is likely gone, destroyed in that courtyard fire in May 1909 or shredded or burned later to ensure it could never surface to contradict the official narrative. Whatever Russell had written about returning a problematic donation, whatever doctrinal clarifications he'd felt were necessary, whatever instructions he'd given to the financial committee in Allegheny, all of that is lost to history. The physical document probably no longer exists anywhere in the world. But in another sense, that letter continues to exist as a symbol, as a reminder that truth can be inconvenient to those in power, that documents can be made to disappear, that history can be rewritten by those who control the archives. The workers who swore silence after the mysterious case of the lost letter, those who witnessed the midnight burnings, who received the warnings about independent thinking, who watched their friends be removed for asking questions, they kept that oath for the most part. Most of them never spoke publicly about what they'd seen. They lived their lives, raised their families, and took their knowledge to their graves. But some, like Samuel White dying of cancer and writing a final letter to his son, felt compelled to leave some record, some testimony that what they'd witnessed had really happened. These fragments of testimony, scattered and incomplete as they are all that remain of a story that was supposed to be erased from history. Today, that story serves as a warning about what happens when religious organizations are allowed to operate without accountability, when faith becomes synonymous with obedience, when asking questions is reframed as spiritual weakness, when loving the organization becomes more important than seeking truth. The patterns established at Bethel in 1909 didn't stay confined to that building or that era. They spread throughout the organization, becoming part of its institutional DNA, shaping how it handles controversy and criticism and internal dissent to this day. Understanding this history doesn't require access to sealed archives or proof of specific conspiracies. It simply requires paying attention to the patterns, noticing how the organization responds when uncomfortable questions are raised, observing what happens to people who prioritize conscience over compliance. The lost letter of 1909 was never found. The archives remain sealed. The official history acknowledges no controversy, no cover-up, no wrongdoing. But the truth has a way of surviving even when documents are destroyed and witnesses are silenced. It survives in the fragments of testimony that slip through the cracks. It survives in the patterns that keep repeating. It survives in the very fact of sealed archives and restricted access and questions that can't be answered. And it survives in the lives of those who were there, who saw what happened, and who had to decide whether they would participate in the silence or pay the price for speaking truth. Perhaps, somewhere in that climate-controlled storage facility where the Watchtower Society keeps its historical materials, Box BKH 09-17 really does contain the lost letter or documents related to it. Perhaps someday, decades or centuries from now, those materials will become public and historians will finally know exactly what happened in March of 1909. Or perhaps the box is empty, its contents long since destroyed, and the restriction is maintained simply to avoid admitting that significant historical materials were eliminated to protect the organization's image. Either way, the story of what happened at Bethel in 1909 continues to echo through time, a reminder that institutions claiming divine authority are still run by humans, And humans are capable of terrible things when they convince themselves that protecting the institution is more important than protecting truth or treating people justly. The workers who swore silence are gone now, their oath fulfilled by death if not by choice. But their story remains, incomplete and contested as it is, a testament to the cost of asking questions in a place where questions weren't welcome, and a warning about what we lose when we allow any institution, no matter how sacred its claims, to operate in the shadows, beyond scrutiny, accountable to no one but itself.